In this pod, we'll look at the impact of attempts to reform Russia up until 1914. We'll also look at some of the reactions to these attempts.
Economically, there had been a series of investments by Nicholas II to improve Russia's situation. Under a succession of Tsarist ministers, Nikolai Bungi, Sergei Witte, and Peter Stolypin, railways were built, foreign investment was encouraged, and landholdings were reformed. However, by 1914, 85% of the population were still peasants. They contributed very little to the Russian economy. Many were still subsistence farming, despite Stolypin's reforms between 1906 and 1911. His ambition to create a new, prosperous peasantry called kulaks had experienced only limited success. In fact, only 10% of land had been consolidated into farms, and nobles still kept the best lands. As a result, by 1913, even the Ministry of Agriculture began to lose confidence in Stolypin's measures. They failed to resolve the peasant grievances.
As part of the reform process, there had been major investment in heavy industry. Economic growth rates showed huge rates of change. Investment in the railways had been dramatic, with over 31,000 kilometres of track laid between 1890 and 1913. However, Russia's economy in 1914 was still not on par with Western countries such as Germany and Great Britain.
In 1914, the grievances of industrial workers and peasants were becoming increasingly apparent. Some began to show an interest in labour movements and trade unions began to appear. The young began to turn to revolutionary parties, including the Bolsheviks and the Social Revolutionaries. Novelist Richard Freeborn noted that there was a growing agitation among the workers in the major cities by this year. In fact, during the first 6 months of 1914, almost half of Russia's industrial workforce took part in strikes. St. Petersburg was on the verge of turmoil.
From a political perspective, very little had changed since 1905. Historians such as David Christian noted that Russia entered the First World War with a traditionally autocratic government. Most changes to the government were superficial. For example, the creation of a state Duma in 1905 had been limited by the introduction of the fundamental laws in April 1906. They were simply a consultative body, and Nicholas II remained an autocratic ruler. The only true limit to the Tsar's power was the size of the Russian Empire.
Nevertheless, there were some changes. Political parties were legally recognized organizations. They had the right to hold political meetings, and membership of the Duma provided some political power. Politics could now be discussed openly in the press, as censorship was relaxed. Political parties even had their own newspapers.
In 1914, Russian society was still very hierarchical. A hierarchy is where one class of people are seen as superior to those of another class. It might be helpful to think of this as a ladder, with the Russian peasantry at the bottom and the elite at the top. The higher up the ladder, the more power, wealth, and influence an individual has. With the rise of industry and the agrarian reforms, a new middle class had emerged, but their newfound wealth did not lead to political power. They had limited representation in the Duma. This caused resentment, as their success went unrecognized by the Tsar and his advisors. The peasantry still made up the majority of the population. There were a few prosperous kulaks, but the majority lived in poverty.